Great, so we saw how to create modules in our project. In this part, we can see how to use existing Terraform modules in our Terraform project so that we don't have to write the whole configuration ourselves. So what we're going to do is that we're going to substitute our subnet module. So basically the subnet module that we created separately to group all the networking resources like internet gateway, subnet, route table, etc., as well as the VPC resource right here. And instead, we're going to use an existing Terraform module for VPC so that we can spare all this configuration ourselves. So let's go to Terraform Registry. And here again, we have a list of existing Terraform modules that we can reuse. And we're going to reuse the VPC module. And we briefly saw this module already in one of the previous videos. And here you can see basically the usage example as well as what inputs we have available. So what we can configure in this VPC in terms of subnets and CIDR block, etc. And what values this module then will expose so that we can use that for our web server module, right? So this is a basic usage example, and if we need some additional values or if we don't need some of these values, we can basically change these and reconfigure all this as we wish using all this information. So first of all, let's actually prepare our project and get rid of all the unnecessary stuff so that we can use this VPC module. So first of all, I'm going to delete the subnet module because we're going to now have that subnet also in that VPC module. So we don't need this separately anymore. So I'm just going to delete this folder. So that again cleans up our project a bit. And in our main.tf, we can also remove this usage and we can remove the VPC resource as well. So this is basically the state that we're going to start with. And right here, we're going to just declare usage of existing VPC module. So I'm just going to copy this example usage and we can basically adjust all the information and attributes as we need. So this is how you can use external modules. So basically the ones that Terraform makes available for you is by defining the name of the module, and the source is basically an address or online source of where that module actually lives, because obviously we don't have that configuration and that code locally, right? We need to install it and download it, and that's basically the address. So online address of that VPC module, just like we declared source for our own module with a path locally, right? So this is local module, this is online module, so to say. And what we are going to do now with this VPC configuration is we want to get exactly the same state as we had previously, right? When we used our own VPC resource and used our own subnet module. So we want the same exact configuration as we had before. And what we had before was we created one subnet in this new VPC, which was public subnet. So we were allowed to access it from internet, like SSH into it from our laptop, as well as access the web server in that subnet. So we had one public subnet in the VPC. We had a CIDR block declared for our VPC, as well as CIDR block for one subnet. And we had that subnet in the second availability zone of our region. In my case, EU West 3B. And we also had basically a tag, which included environmental prefix and then VPC, and same for a subnet, right? So this is basically what we need to reconfigure using this VPC module. So let's get started and do that step by step. First of all, the CIDR block, we want to reference that as a variable, right? We already have that variable right here. It's a VPC CIDR block. And that's what we're gonna use here. Because again, we don't want to hard code the values in a configuration in case we want to change that or we want to set them differently based on different environments. So we again want to parameterize everything. So we have the CIDR block for the VPC. Now we have the AZs, right? These are the availability zones. And we could actually leave all 3 AZs and create 3 subnets. And this will be the configuration for that. However, let's stick with the previous example with 1 subnet in 1 AZ. So I'm going to remove the other 2 and leave the second AZ, right? Of my region, which is again EU West 3B, right? However, again, we want to parameterize that. So I'm going to extract that and instead reference it as a variable. Again, in case this changes, we would only need to change it in one place. So variable is called avail zone. That's what we called it. And there you go. Now we have private subnets and public subnets. Private subnets is something that is not open to internet. This can be used for spinning off a database server, for example, or something or component that shouldn't be directly exposed to internet. However, we only have a web server, so we don't need a private subnet. So we're going to remove that line. And now we're left with public subnets. With the previous configuration, this was creating 1 private and 1 public subnet in each AZ. Again, let's stick to the previous configuration. So I'm gonna delete those 2 because we just have 1 subnet, right? And the CIDR block of that subnet, we already parameterized that. Let's go to variables and there you go. This is our variable. So that is configured. And these 2 lines here, net gateway and VPN gateway for our VPC are actually for our specific use case. We don't need those, so we can remove them to make the configuration simpler. And here we have the tags, right? So just like previously, we can give it a name tag. So let's do name and var inv prefix VPC. However, we also had subnet tag, and if we want to add that, we can actually check in the input fields what the input parameter name should be. So if I search for subnet tag, there you go. We have public subnet tags, additional tags for public subnet. So this is what we need. So I'm going to copy that. This is basically the syntax. We see that it is an object, so we can edit right here. And this was also a name tag for subnet with inv prefix and then subnet 1. And there you go. This is our VPC and subnet configuration. So basically we have way less code here. We removed the whole module that we had created. We don't have the VPC resource anymore. We're just using or reusing the existing module and then passing in just a couple of parameters that we want to configure for the VPC. And then subnet, internet gateway, route table, all of this will basically be configured for us in the background. So let's just check that all our variables are declared. VPC, CIDR block, subnet CIDR block, avail zone, and prefix. Let's check that in the tfvars file. And we have all those values set here. Now, before we actually execute and apply those changes, there is something else we need to adjust here. And that is referencing some of the resources in our VPC from our My App Server module. The first one is the VPC ID itself. Right before we had a resource, AWS VPC, and we were getting the ID value from that. Now we have the module, so we can very easily do module VPC, the name of the module basically, and this will give us the whole module object, and we need an ID from that, right? So how do I know which attributes does this module expose for all of its resources? Again, very simple. I go back to the documentation, and in the outputs list, I can look up VPC ID, and there you go. This is the ID of the VPC itself. So I'm going to copy that and reference it here. So this will give us the ID of the VPC that this module will create. So we have the VPC ID now. The rest of them are variables, except for this one right here, which is subnet ID. So basically we need the ID of the subnet that we have declared right here. So how do we get that? Again, module VPC, and go back to the output list, and here look for public subnets right here. You see a list of IDs of public subnets. So we have the whole array, and we can get our ID from there. So I'm going to copy that, and this will give me an array of all the IDs. We just have one subnet, so we just have one ID, and that's basically the only element in this array, which we can get with this index, right? So get me the first element of this array, which is going to be our only subnet ID, right? If we had 3, for example, then using that index, we can get the first one or the second one or the third one, right? So our server, our web server EC2 instance will be launched in this subnet, right? And it's important to specify a subnet ID here, because if we skip it, if we don't specify it here, it will actually be launched in the default VPC's subnet, one of its subnets, right? So we want that to be in our VPC, in our subnet. And what I'm also gonna change in our configuration, this is optional, but I'm going to configure our web server module so that it creates a new security group instead of reusing the default one. Because as I mentioned previously a couple of times, this is the best practice, creating the new resources as you need them using Terraform, and basically leaving the default as is. So basically just remove the default here. So this will give us a new security group resource. Let's change the naming here. Let's add a name attribute, and that will be it. So that's basically all the change that we need. And let's fix the reference to that here as well. So the type and the name of that security group. And there you go. Our configuration is ready. So now we can apply our new configuration. And I have deleted all my resources, so my Terraform state actually should be empty. So let's do Terraform state list. And there you go. We're going to create everything from a clean state. So let's do Terraform plan. This will give us a preview as well as validate that our configuration is written correctly. So everything looks good. Now let's actually apply this configuration. I'm going to do auto approve. And now we should see all the resources getting created. And in the output, you see that all the resources from module.vpc that are being created, the VPC itself, internet gateway, route table, subnet, etc., some of which we had to create ourselves previously, so they're all basically included in this module. And now the server itself is coming up and everything looks good. Let's actually go to AWS Management Console to check there as well. Here is our server that is getting initialized. Let's also check our VPC and its configuration. And there you go. This is the VPC with all the default components and resources that have been created. Let's actually go to route table. And here you see that automatically in background, without any extra configuration, a new route table got created instead of using a default one, as is the best practice. and that is explicitly associated with a subnet, just like we did in one of the previous examples. And the routes basically has the internal traffic handling inside the VPC, as well as internet gateway for connecting our VPC to internet. So everything configured the same way as before, but without much effort on configuration from outside, basically all out of the box from this VPC module. And if our EC2 instance is already initialized, like this, we can first of all SSH into it. So our private key is working, as well as internet connectivity to port 22 is working. And as you remember, we are executing an entry script on that server. When it's provisioned, that installs Docker and also starts Docker container. So if I do docker ps, Docker should be installed and container running. And as well as that, we also opened port 8080 through security group. So if I grab that public IP address and do port 8080, I should see welcome to Nginx page. So everything works perfectly, and we have much less code than before just by reusing an existing VPC module that does everything in the background using the best practice configurations. As well as we saw how to use an existing module in addition to creating and using our own internal module. And finally, just like before, we can create own feature branch for these changes to keep the configuration update there. So I'm going to do git checkout. And basically we can call this whatever we want. I'm going to call these modules, maybe use existing. And these are the changes that we made. Deleted subnet module, as well as updated the main TF, and we're creating a new security group instead of using default one. So and finally we can push the branch. So this is the branch where you can find all this configuration code as a reference.